So yes, as we saw in the 2010s, even activism can be co-opted by capitalism. Overall though, we haven't even reached a critical mass of people who are saying that decolonization is what we have to pursue. A few years ago, I was walking down a bike path in Boston, Massachusetts when I saw something that blew my mind. On an ordinary spring day, much like the day that I'm recording this video, I saw a person walk by me that had a shirt on. A shirt that was highly stylized, like it wasn't a shirt that they just made in their house. And the shirt was actually quite simple. It just said in big letters the word Decolonize. I saw the person wearing this shirt and they walked past me and I was floored. Keeping in mind, right, that this happened probably in 2018, 2019. It was a couple years ago at this point. And I don't want to rag on Boston, but this is pretty par for the course for what the culture was in Boston at that time. And I suppose I should mention that the person wearing the shirt was, let's just say, not a visible minority, not a visible person of color. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know. But that sight has really stuck with me for some reason. In the scope of my own political education, I was thinking about decolonization a lot at that time, and for some years before then as well. So to see somebody just casually walking around with decolonization or decolonize as a fashion statement really threw me for a loop. And as it turns out, I was ahead of the curve, because this actually sparked a minor controversy back in about 2020. In November 2020, Teen Vogue covered a similar controversy, in which a person was photographed wearing a mask featuring the word decolonizer with a TM at the end. The letters TM implying that the phrase had been trademarked. For the article, Teen Vogue reached out to the designer, who clarified that he had not in fact trademarked the phrase decolonizer, but had appended the TM to his designs because people had been copying his designs. The whole article is really good, so I will link it in the description. Aside from the intellectual property debate, it does raise the other question of whether or not decolonization should be a fashion statement, which begets another question, which is, what does decolonization even mean at this point? For people unaware of the word decolonization or its status as a cultural symbol, well, this might not be the video for you to introduce the concept, but I will go over some rudimentary definitions of it in a little bit. From what I can tell though, this conversation has been going on for a number of years now. Perhaps even to the point where the invoking of the phrase decolonization is now up for question. Even to the extent that people who once rallied around the banner of decolonization now have some critiques of it. In January 2020, the podcast Decolonized Buffalo featured Dr. Kim Tallbear on its show. Decolonized Buffalo is an amazing podcast. I listen to it a lot, but I do want to spotlight this particular episode entitled Native American DNA. In the scope of this episode, the host, Rick, posed the question to Dr. Tallbear as to the relevance of the word decolonization and how people can and do use it. I'm going to play an excerpt of the conversation between Rick and Dr. Tallbear. I will link the podcast episode and timestamps in the description. Here's what they had to say.
I want to talk about the word decolonization, because that word gets thrown around a lot in social media. Like, let's decolonize. And I get some really weird responses. And my main thing is asking people, how do you envision decolonization politically without the settler states? How does that look like? And a lot of people tell me, you're thinking too far ahead. I'm like, no, I'm not. We have to imagine this, in my point of view, what that looks like, or we won't know how to get there.
If you're going to use the word decolonization, think, how is it restoring indigenous land resources and or life?
Exactly.
Right? How is it doing that? And so if, I think about that all the time when I use the term now. I never use it without thinking, what am I saying? Right? Yeah. It's not just a social justice project. It's not just any social justice project. There has to be an element of restoration. We're always working with imperfect terms. We're also always working with terms that don't translate to everybody across time and space. And we're always going to have air quotes around the words that we're using, right? It's just, we're working in colonizer languages. If we can't be speaking in indigenous languages, we're going to have a set of super compromised words. Yeah. Right. And so I will use sovereignty sometimes, but I kind of half wince when I say it. Right. I do use decolonization. I try to be more mindful of the way that I use it now. But I half wince at all the words that I have to use. Yeah. Because they're problematic for somebody and for good reason. Yeah. Yeah.
So hearing this for the first time when I listened to this episode, again, I was floored. For context, Dr. Kim Tallbear is a genetic researcher. She is an indigenous Dakota person who was born in the United States and now lectures and researches in Canada. According to Dr. Tallbear's bio, she is interested in the historical and ongoing roles of science and technology, technoscience, in the colonization of indigenous peoples and others. That is to say, she is a well-respected indigenous scholar and researcher. So for her to offer this critique of the word decolonization, or at least how the word is used, is really monumental for me as a person that is not indigenous. But it also does validate me a little bit for how I felt when I saw the person in Boston wearing that shirt. Now, the political climate that we're currently in has shifted pretty radically from that of the 2010s. That much should be pretty obvious. In the 2010s, we saw a lot of discourse and popular imagination about what decolonization was and is supposed to be. So I do want to start a conversation in the scope of this video as to, have we lost the plot with regards to the discourse of decolonization? Has it been commodified or defanged so much that it is now meaningless? Is it something that still has any revolutionary potential? My personal investment in this conversation is that when I first learned about the concept and movement of decolonization, it really spoke to me. I say this as a person living in the United States who has ancestrally experienced colonization, arguably on both sides of my family. And I also think it's very important to have a good understanding of the words and discourses that we use and also sharpen them as necessary. So the first step in this conversation is to define what decolonization is and maybe also what it is not. Now, please do not interpret my making this video as me staking any claim of ownership or authority on decolonization. Mostly, I just want to continue this conversation as it becomes increasingly relevant as time goes on. And for people who are genuinely wanting to learn more, I will leave some helpful links in the description. Okay, so what is decolonization? Is it a return to pre-colonial society? Is it a transference of leadership from one group to another? My answer to both of those questions is no. Let's take a look at the definition used in the Teen Vogue article mentioned before. Quote, "For many, to decolonize means political action taken to repatriate land stolen from indigenous people, land which is to be given back to them with the purpose of sovereignty. But in today's landscape, decolonize has also taken on a host of different meanings, becoming much more mainstream, at times being used as a metaphor or more often a quip emblazoned on products like t-shirts and masks." So yes, one very important component of decolonization is to restore indigenous land rights and or sovereignty. Now, we also do have to have a very good understanding of the mechanisms of colonialism and colonization throughout the world, which is a little bit outside the scope of this video. But where I'm going to kind of land with my definition is that decolonize or decolonization is to mean undoing colonial institutions and values. This is a little bit in juxtaposition with the term anti-colonial. There's a big debate on the internet as to what is decolonial and what is anti-colonial. I'm going to say that anti-colonial basically means the active resistance of colonization that is currently going on. Now, the theoretical definitions of decolonization go back quite far. The global discourse of decolonization goes back to the 1950s and 1960s. This was a time when European powers still had their colonies in places like Africa, Asia, South America, and North America. So at that point, decolonization meant giving up control of these colonies. The United Nations, for example, has a special committee on decolonization that was formed in 1961. So we should say that the political project, the institutional project of decolonization is ongoing. Also in 1961, a book was published called The Wretched of the Earth. The Wretched of the Earth was written by Frantz Fanon. Fanon was born in Martinique, which is a French possession in the Caribbean. He then went on to be a psychiatrist within the French colonial state. So Fanon's treatise within The Wretched of the Earth was basically that colonized people have every right to resist colonization. This is a foundational text for the discourse of decolonization and just in general in the history of the world, so I recommend that you read it if you haven't already. So throughout the past 60 to 70 years, decolonization has meant the principal return of land and land rights to people from whom it was originally taken. One other very foundational text in this discourse is the text Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. This text was published in 2012. This is a shorter text, I will link it in the description, but it is one that is invoked quite a bit in the present day as well. Arguably, its most famous contribution to the discourse is its final paragraph. Quote, "Decolonization offers a different perspective to human and civil rights-based approaches to justice, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere." So I want to remind people that these are just texts that explore the topic. I don't think that there is any really particular manual or guide to decolonization. But we can see pretty easily that people have used this word decolonize with their own creative liberties. I'm going to go through a few examples now of people using this word decolonize to mean things that distract a little bit from the ingrained meaning. Again, there might not be anything inherently wrong with how this word is being used in these examples, but I just want to kind of pull them up and explore them a little bit. I want to see if they're actually achieving anything related to the political project of decolonization. First up, decolonize your diet. The conversation of decolonizing one's diet is a little bit multi-layered. On one level, it's about taking stock of the actual food that we eat, and on another level, it's thinking about foodways, like how food is grown, cultivated, and delivered to us as consumers. That is to say, perhaps getting away from factory and industrial farming and returning to a different way of getting food into our mouths, but also proximally potentially getting away from food items that were derived from colonization, for example, sugar. I don't know if this term has been formally copyrighted, but the phrase decolonize your diet is the name of a book published in 2015. This book is actually a cookbook composed of plant-based recipes from Mexican-American cuisine. And while the book was published in 2015, it originates in a blog started in 2010 by Luz Calvo. Let's read the description of this book and see what it's all about. More than just a cookbook, Decolonize Your Diet redefines what is meant by traditional Mexican food by reaching back through centuries of history to reclaim heritage crops as a source of protection from modern diseases. Authors Luz Calvo and Catriona Rueda Esquivel are life partners. When Luz was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2006, they both radically changed their diets and began seeking out recipes featuring healthy vegetarian Mexican foods. They promote a diet rich in plants indigenous to the Americas, such as corn, beans, squash, greens, herbs, and seeds, and are passionate about the ideas that Mexicans and Latinas living in the United States and Canada need to ditch the fast food and return to their own culture's food roots for both physical health and spiritual connection. Steeped in history but very much rooted in the contemporary world, Decolonize Your Diet will introduce readers to the energizing healing properties of a plant-based Mexican-American diet. On the surface, it is very cool, especially knowing the author's personal journeys with illness and how that impacted their want to consume more consciously. And there is a lot to be said about how indigenous foodways have been supplanted by the ones instituted by the imperial and colonial systems. Now, does this book or concept achieve any political aims? Arguably, no. Unless we're talking about cultivation and permaculture, we're still going to these same supermarkets and getting these ingredients. Nevertheless, this is still a really cool project, even if it is only concerned with the mindfulness of how we get the food that we eat every day, how it gets to us every day. I think about how in places like Puerto Rico, fast food is everywhere, and especially American fast food, and yet indigenous crops like jautilla and breadfruit are not widely eaten. So while this book is not a systemic critique at all, it does posit some really cool alternatives. That said, the cultivation of heritage crops is kind of tied into this notion of indigenous sovereignty and land stewardship. So I think there's fertile ground here for something. Our diets are products of colonial and imperial systems. And if the intent of the book is to just decolonize your personal diet, then I'd argue that it is pretty successful. Overall, though, it still falls pretty squarely within this conscious consumerism type movement and approach. How do you feel about the paradigm of decolonizing your diet? Let me know in the comments. Next, decolonize your bookshelf. This phrase, decolonize your bookshelf, has popped up a little bit more in recent years, starting more in 2019, 2020, and that time period. Keeping in mind that throughout the 2010s, we also had the hashtag #WeNeedDiverseBooks. This hashtag was a rallying cry for the publishing industry to invest more in authors of color and to publish more books relevant to people of color in general. One of the first posts I could find about Decolonize Your Bookshelf was a post by Australian book reviewer Hope Lee. Her blog post is written more as a how-to. It's pretty interesting, so I do want to read a couple excerpts from it. Hope wrote, "Decolonizing your bookshelf, in my words, is asking readers to actively resist colonialist notions of narrative, storytelling, art, and literature. There is a tendency in literary studies and book culture in general to prize certain types of authors and narratives over others. But decolonizing your bookshelf is more than just resisting snobbery. It is really asking you to reassess your whole understanding of the literary canon." It continues with a list of what decolonization isn't. She wrote, "Decolonization isn't 1. Throwing away every book you own written by a white person. 2. Only reading indigenous authors for the rest of your life. 3. Saying that marginalized groups are superior to dominant white groups. Or 4. Just for marginalized groups to practice. For marginalized groups, in particular indigenous groups, decolonization is about reclaiming, celebrating, and nurturing indigenous identities. It is about resisting the idea that white European notions of beauty, food, art, culture, and clothing, etc. are above all other cultures." So from what I can glean from this post, decolonizing your bookshelf is about investing more in the works of authors of color, in addition to questions about the books that are already on the shelf. In particular, do books by white authors treat characters of color with dignity? I have a lot of thoughts about this. Around 2018, I was a part of a culture jamming project called Colonizer BS. The point of this project was to start conversations about the narratives present in books, especially bestsellers. As a part of this project, I would go to bookstores where certain books were sold and affix a sticker onto the book that said, "This piece of media is colonizer bullshit." So I think projects like this do have their use, especially when we think about what is and is not considered to be literary canon. And these projects are especially salient when they are targeted at English teachers, librarians, booksellers, and other gatekeepers. Side note, most librarians are super rad and love projects like this. How the people in the bookshops felt about this, well, that's up for debate. So something like this is what we would call the cultural work of decolonization rather than the political work. Again, not a net negative at all, but it doesn't necessarily further any political aims. And yet, if through campaigns like this we're getting more books into the hands of people of color and especially youth, that is furthering more political education, which is why library book bans is such a big issue right now. Really, I think the application of a project like Decolonize Your Bookshelf is to apply it to curricula rather than book consumers and book lovers. As in, if you're teaching poetry, teach Derek Walcott next to Mary Oliver. Identity development is arguably a political aim, so it is important for youth especially to have access to books like this. And lastly, the catchphrase, decolonize your mind. This catchphrase is a little bit all-encompassing, but essentially could mean undo the colonial values that you've internalized. For example, things like European beauty standards and the concept of a racial hierarchy to begin with. So we've all heard this catchphrase, right? I feel like it's a very popular thing that has been uttered, especially throughout the 2010s and into the present day. And yet, I do not know who this quote is attributed to. Some people attribute it to bell hooks, some people attribute it to Yuri Kochiyama. I couldn't find anything to substantiate either of those attributions. In my mind, it is probably attributed to a Black American social theorist like maybe Sis the Soldier, but I couldn't find anything to substantiate that either. Now, this phrase sort of hits a peak in the mid-2010s, but I think it goes back further than that. I'm just not sure where exactly it originates from. In my research of this video, I tried to trace a genealogy of this phrase, and I really came up kind of empty-handed, but I did want to share what I found. In my research, I found the following. A blog entitled Decolonize Your Mind, created in 2009. This ad published in a Northampton, Massachusetts newspaper in 2004, advertising a summer job. And finally, this excerpt from a DeKalb, Illinois newspaper published in 2001. This excerpt begins with the quote, "Decolonize your minds," with an S, and it is attributed to Japanese-American activist Darren Muko. It reads, "Decolonize your minds, rethinking a darker shade of activism, as told by Darren Muko, will take a brief historical look at the intersections of civil rights movements of the African American, Native American, Latino/A, and Asian communities. This will be used as a springboard to talk about the roles of activists today on college campuses." Again, I couldn't track down a solid attribution for the origin of this phrase, but this shows that it has been circulating and reverberating for a while. So yes, this does beget a conversation about how colonialism and colonialist mentalities replicate themselves through psychology. To bring up Frantz Fanon again, his book Black Skin, White Masks addresses this in detail. Another book which addresses this, even if cited less, is The Intimate Enemy by Ashis Nandy, which looks at colonialism in the context of India. So yes, the phrase decolonize your mind might have come out of activist movements, but I think at this point in time it does resound a little bit cliche. And perhaps the people that need to decolonize their minds the most are not going to be listening to that message. The final example that I want to bring into this discussion is not actually a slogan or a catchphrase, but in fact the name of an activist group. This would be Decolonize This Place, formed in New York City in 2016. So I do remember hearing about Decolonize This Place back in the day. The guiding principle of organizations like Decolonize This Place revolve around museums as cultural institutions. As it read on their website in 2016, quote, "Designed as an action-oriented space, Decolonize This Place will challenge the dynamics of white supremacy and colonial dispossession that continue to underlie the landscape of the art system and the world at large." So this organization was largely rooted in solidarity organizing. Some of their more recent actions included the following: calling on the American Museum of Natural History in New York City to rename Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and calling on the Brooklyn Museum to stand against displacement and gentrification. So while this organization is no longer really active, it did demonstrate a political output for decolonization. And this campaign is notably not over. There are still museums all across the world that hold on to colonial artifacts that were robbed and sacked from the original places. So while museums are not concerned with land specifically, this repatriation of objects is still very politically meaningful. So amidst this panoply of examples, we still have to answer this question that I posed at the beginning of the video. Have we lost the plot on decolonization? Is decolonization cringe? Is it a notion that still carries any weight or packs any punch today? I don't really think there's any answer I could give that could do this decolonization movement any justice. So let me just say this. We have to keep in mind that decolonization is still largely theoretical and unimplemented. There are still many colonies across the world. There is still colonization ongoing and even newly happening throughout the world. So when we think about situations in which we are invoking decolonization without advancing indigenous sovereignty or the struggle for Black lives, that is elite capture at work. The phrase elite capture has gained some new limbs after its use in the book by Olufemi Taiwo of the same name. My understanding of elite capture is that it is how the global, rich, and powerful use the language and discourse of the oppressed to further their own agendas. Agendas which generally include political colonization and resource extraction. So yes, as we saw in the 2010s, even activism can be co-opted by capitalism. Then it was very profitable for corporations to appear socially conscious, which is not how it is now. So when it comes to the decolonization movement, I wouldn't say we've lost the plot as much as I'm saying that the plot is still in development. Again, I don't have the solutions to how we implement decolonization. I don't even really think it's appropriate for me to posit on any of those solutions. Overall though, we haven't even reached a critical mass of people who are saying that decolonization is what we have to pursue, what we have to prioritize. So even if we've reached a point where invoking the word decolonization is a little bit cringe, we can still come back from this. We can still very much get back on track with what the movement is calling for. I think where we largely get stuck is not even in the development of a one-and-all solution, but in just the lack of imagination in general of what could be. Among other things, this is what Tuck and Yang are saying when they say decolonization is an elsewhere. The image of an elsewhere means that we need to imagine something that doesn't quite exist yet. As in, we have to try something new. Even if it's not fully fleshed out or developed, we still have to try it and see how it goes. Even if it's proprietary to say, all right, we'll try it for a year and then see where we're at then. Obviously, this is a very reductive way to look at a large project like decolonization, but I think it does help to kind of chunk it down into bite-sized little pieces. And even then, the conclusion that decolonization is an elsewhere still, I think, doesn't really capture all of what it needs to. When I think of decolonization, I don't think of it as a return or an elsewhere or anything else really tangible. It's more of this indescribable amorphous thing that we just still haven't even reached how to get to. Like, imagine you invert the colors on life, and maybe that's what decolonization looks like. I don't know. Personally, I just hope that we haven't lost sight of what the goal is, which, in the words of Belizean poet Ruthine Taylor, is, if we would know what heaven is, we must build it here. Alright guys, that's the video. Thanks again for making it this far. Whether this topic was relatable to you or you think I live in a leftist bubble, please feel free to let me know in the comments. This is Hassan with the Diaspora Gothic channel. Remember to stay connected, stay rooted, and stay dramatic. Bye!
Decolonization is about the restoration of indigenous land and life. Yes. And this is why people are talking about hashtag land back, right? Yeah. You've got a lot of people doing land-based education in the North now. I'm sure it's, and I know it's happening in the Pacific and Hawaii. Yeah. There's like people doing this. So yeah, land back, resources back, right? And you look at the majority, a big part of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous managed lands, and that's under assault, right? So where indigenous people are, biodiversity is more preserved. Where indigenous people continue to exist in mass and they have this relationship with their homelands, that's really important for the planet. Yeah. It's important for them as cultures, but it's also important for all of our non-human relatives in the world. Yeah. This is why everybody needs to get invested in restoring land and life to indigenous peoples, because that's what's going to be good for the planet.